back, flyers, all of you air crews. You've returned from our premiere episode to enjoy the next stage of our Masters of the Air Law of Armed Conflict brief, brought to you by the American Red Cross International Humanitarian Law Program. Once again, I'm Thomas Harper. I'm Senior Counsel for International Humanitarian Law here at the American Red Cross at our national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And we are going to launch right into part one of Masters of the Air. We're going to start none other than with the 100th Bomb Group's journey from Greenland to England. So they use Greenland as a staging point, and they've got to endure the long flight from there to England to get to their base of operations for World War II. And we're going to talk about none other than Lieutenant Crosby, the 100th Bomb Group's A-plus navigator. He's also an A-plus barfer, just a tremendous ability to vomit consistently during flight. And during this flight in particular, like many others, Lieutenant Crosby has a lot of trouble. He's trying to navigate while simultaneously barfing constantly into a bag. We see him later on barfing into a helmet. Really anything that can contain his barf, he will do it into. That kind of impacts his duties, impacts his ability to find the right pathway for this B-17. And to the surprise and horror of the pilots up front, they realize, and Lieutenant Crosby realizes pretty quick, that they're not in the right spot. In fact, the wall of flak that starts to go up in front of them sets off the recognition that it's France. They are not over the coast of England. They are coming into France, and none other than not just normal France, but Nazi-occupied France. This is Fortress Europe. We're talking spring of 1943. The Nazis have an iron grip over France and the rest of Europe. So I said he was an A-plus navigator. Right now, we're going to downgrade him to C- navigator. Crosby, we all love you, but this was kind of a bolo. The issue that I want to explore here is whether an unarmed B-17 like Crosby's can be engaged, because their aircraft at this point in time, they're not on a bombing run. They're not going to attack some target in Germany or run a reconnaissance mission. This is an unarmed B-17 that is just quite literally transporting the crew from point A to point B. They're not looking to cross into enemy lines. Can the Germans engage Crosby's B-17? Is that fair? Is that legal under the law of war? So to frame that, we need to go to really the very core of the law of armed conflict, of international humanitarian law. Understand those are, as I said in the original episode, those are synonymous terms. When you talk about the law of war, it's the same as the law of armed conflict. It's the same as international humanitarian law. Those terms are all interchangeable. So what is distinction? What is this principle all about? Well, your basic rule is that we want to use force, use military force against actual fighters, against combatants or military objectives. We don't want, as a sort of human society, military force to be intentionally used to target civilians or civilian objects. So those are the operative terms right there. We want to use force against combatants and military objectives, and that's it. So an unarmed B-17, is that a military objective? What the law is concerned with when it comes to a B-17 is, what is it, right? And a B-17, let's just break this down to common sense level. This is an aircraft. This isn't a 737 designed to get you from your house to a vacation in Hawaii. This is a weapon of war, right? This is a flying fortress, as it's nicknamed. This is a military aircraft that was designed from day one to be a weapon of war, and an effective one at that, bristling with firepower, capable of carrying and delivering a significant bomb load. And so when you talk about what is a military objective, some things, some objects are military objectives solely by their very nature. So a B-17 is a military object because of that design, because of that nature. It's really irrelevant whether it's armed, what bombs it's carrying, whether it's carrying any bombs. You're talking about in the middle of World War II, an Allied bomber flying into occupied enemy territory. It's going to be a military objective, plain and simple. Let's next turn to really the most significant part of episode 1 of Masters of the Air, and that's the raid on Bremen. Specifically, they're heading for submarine pens that are there in Bremen. So you see them laying out the target there. And for those that are unfamiliar with sort of World War II era bombing terms, or just bombing terms in general, they use the term IP all the time as an acronym. It gets thrown around in every single episode of Masters of the Air. That's what's known as an initial point. So think of that as a landmark. So it's an object that the aircraft, that the bomber flight can navigate off of. And from that IP, they're going to go into flat, sort of steady flight to allow that bombardier to get onto target and drop the bombs exactly where they want them to be. So the IP is a critical navigation point. That's why you see it referenced so often. I just don't think they ever use the full term. So they're briefed on the IP, which is on the northwest of Bremen. And then on that east side of the river, they're briefed that that's where the German submarine pens are. So the target is Nazi U-boat pens. And we talked in terms of distinction about military objectives versus civilian objects. That's a military base, right? A sub pen, those are military targets, even though in this case, in this picture, those submarines are moored up. They're not actually out patrolling. And this is a really juicy target for the Americans. At the time in 1943 and up to that point in the war, Nazi U-boats were just causing absolute havoc in the Atlantic for both naval operations, so for warships, they were a huge problem, and for Allied shipping. So the business of getting supplies, say from America to Britain, Nazi U-boats were all over the Atlantic. They were a dreaded foe to face, and taking out a central hub of those U-boats was a really juicy and important military target for the Americans. Notice in that briefing, though, that the command team doesn't say that, hey, Bremen is your target because U-boats are there. The target is specifically the U-boat pens, and that's really important, and it ties into sort of the timing and the nature of this strike. Now, we won't dive into it here, but a central theme that runs through all of the episodes in Masters of the Air is the business of the Americans conducting daylight raids versus the nighttime raids that the British are conducting. I'll dive more into that in our part 2, where we cover episode 2 of Masters of the Air. But to suffice it to say that there's a real reason for conducting this mission on Bremen in daylight. They know they're going behind enemy lines. They know, as the briefing indicates, they're going into significant flak against an enemy that's equipped with radar. This is a high danger mission for a high importance target, but they're using that daylight that's ultimately impacted by the significant cloud cover because it's important to get on to target. Now, the bomber flight, the 100th launches, they go into immediate heavy cloud banks that are leading up to the target. The Germans, as they expected, using their radar, go to man their anti-aircraft batteries very, very quickly. They put up a tremendous wall of flak fire. So these rounds, artillery-sized rounds that are exploding and sending shrapnel all over the place in the air that the bomber group is flying around. It's a real massive threat to the flight. But equally threatening is the cloud cover that's there. And pretty quickly we see as the bombardier attempts to sight in on the lead aircraft, those pens and find the IP, they can't find the target. It is completely covered by these clouds. And it raises the question of positive identification. I mentioned the extensiveness of that briefing. I mentioned the business of the daylight raid. And the Americans' goal here, the command goal, which we'll talk about in a second, is to drop bombs onto those U-boat pens. That's what they need to destroy to really negatively impact the Nazi war effort. So we use this term positive identification, or PID, right? That's the concept of being sure to some degree, maybe not mathematically 100% sure, but being positive, reasonably sure that you are about to engage the target that you intend, right? That's a really critical aspect when it comes to applying the law to situations like this, because again, going back to that principle, we want to use force only against military targets, only against combatants, right? And so if you're not sure what you're dropping bombs on, that kind of negates your ability to abide by that particular rule. There's also a tactical and a strategic implication here, which we'll get into in a second. But notice as well that tied into this mission, they don't just get briefed on, hey, submarine pens are here, but the business of the IP and this briefing about a central pen being a point of impact, those have real legal significance here. There's a reason for them. So when a mission like this is planned, the trajectory of the bombers and where they begin to bomb matters, right? Your trajectory impacts how those bombs are going to fall. In other words, the flight path of those bombers is going to dictate where those bombs land. So you can imagine flying horizontal, say along the riverbank there, is going to lay down a good base of explosions along those U-boat pens that are situated horizontally along the river. If you were to cut perpendicular, like right across the river, you're not going to hit the entire pen, perhaps, and you might go into an area that just isn't your target. So say the town of Bremen, right? The point of impact is also really important because when and where you drop your bombs also matters very, very greatly. Because the moment that's sort of your central aim point, and all the way up until modern day operations, including stuff that's happening right now in our world, the business of calculating the sort of point of impact or the release point for bombs, it really helps dictate how your target is going to be destroyed. And to tie it back into the principle of distinction, ensuring that you're only going to hit your intended target, that you're minimizing collateral damage. Because again, here, the target is the U-boat pens. They're not trying to blow up Bremen, and understand that the Germans aren't the only ones that live in Bremen. There are other folks that live there, civilians, etc. The Americans are trying to blow up the submarine pens and really don't have a concern about anything else. So you see this culminating moment, the climax of the episode, where the commander gets that feedback from the bombardier. He can't see Jack through the bomb site. It's all obscured by clouds, and the commander scrubs the mission. He says he's not going to drop bombs on a target he can't see, and frustratedly, the bomb group turns back to head back to England. They have to dump their bombs in the channel, the English Channel, and they go back home. It brings up this interesting juxtaposition between the law of war, the overall body of law we're talking about, and what's known as rules of engagement. So ROE for short, rules of engagement, that's a term that's just wound its way in to popular culture. We kind of hear it all the time, even outside of military context. But while the two terms are related, they're not the same. And so it's important to understand the difference, because what you're seeing in this episode is not a function necessarily of the law of war saying, hey, you can't drop those bombs. That's illegal. That's not what's happening. This is the command exercising a rule of engagement on a tactical decision to not drop the bombs. They're connected legally, but let's explore that. So think about this in a series of like concentric circles, right? So at the broadest level, right, you've got all the possible actions you could ever take. So drop the bombs, like shoot your guns from the B-17s down at the U-boat pens below, and crash your plane into the ground. All possible actions. So if you could just do anything at all, that's the widest possible area. Anything and everything that you could possibly do. Well, the law of war, the law of armed conflict, operates to bring that circle in a little bit. It says, well, you can't do anything in war, right? That really unnecessarily kills innocent people. It destroys innocent people's property. We don't want that to happen. So we're going to say you can't do everything. So the circle gets a little bit smaller. Your available actions starts to get a little bit smaller, a little narrower under when you apply the law of war, right? ROE, or specific rules of engagement, narrow that further. So what rules of engagement are is not a there's no clause or portion of the Geneva Conventions or the Hague Conventions that talks about or dictates what ROE are. Rules of engagement are a tool for a military commander to use. They are created and crafted by a military commander. They are enforced by military commands, and they are used not to handcuff their own forces, but ROE is used to help shape the battlefield and ensure that your objectives, tactical, strategic, whatever, are accomplished to your satisfaction, right? They're used to shape the actions of your fighting force to accomplish your specific goals. Here in this case, the commander had an ROE that said we need to drop bombs only on the subpens at Bremen. Doing anything else, just dropping an area bombing on Bremen, not only might not ensure the destruction of the submarine pens there, but it could kill a whole lot of people that the Americans and the Allied forces are trying to liberate. Their goal isn't to wipe out Bremen and kill anyone that's there, regardless of who they are and what they're doing. Their goal is to disrupt Nazi submarine operations. And so the ROE, that the business of that commander wanting positive identification of the subpens before dropping bombs, that's not a function of the law of war. I think at the broad level, if he wanted to drop those bombs, the law of war says, well, that's okay, right? They are distinguishing, they are intending to hit a target that's a military objective, those U-boat pens. The law of war allows for sort of reasonable mistakes. Hey, what were the circumstances that you were encountering at the time? Well, hey, we intended to hit the U-boat pens, but the cloud cover just kind of obscured our view. We did our best. Our navigators got us to where we should be. They used timing and their maps and navigation tools to get us right where the target should have been. And we just couldn't control it after that point. And so the collateral damage that resulted is unfortunate. It's terrible, but it's not unlawful. So understand that if we were just operating in that yellow circle, just only applying the broad law of war, they could have dropped those bombs and the Bremen mission would have been perfectly lawful. The decision not to drop those bombs sits squarely in that red circle. It's a function of ROE in that commander, and it causes issues, right? The crews there really kind of subtly or not so subtly question the commander's decision to not drop on the target, given the dangers that they faced. Well, I want to thank you, Air Crews, for joining us for your Part 1 legal briefing. We'll be back next week with Episode 2. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.